All right, now we're on to the core. Before we move on, just a quick little recap. We've already looked at a lot of the different terminology, the different movements, the bones, the structures, the joints. Those should become more familiar to you now as we've talked over them in different segments as well. Then we looked at the shoulder in particular, this joint being really made for mobility and how to create stability with the two elements. We had one was the scapular stabilizers and second was the humeral stabilizers. And then we looked at the hip and we looked at this trampoline effect all the way around the hip joint of the different muscles that pull in different directions to help to stabilize the hip. On the front, we had the iliopsoas, the antagonist. On the back, we had gluteus maximus. The abductors on the side, we had glute med, min, and tensor fascia lata. Remember TFL pulling on that IT band to help coordinate not just the hip, but also the knee. And then we also looked at the inner thigh muscles, here are the adductors, and the external rotators. And we talked about them as a group with piriformis and the go-go-Q muscles, along with what we talked about, remember, gluteus maximus as well. So we've got some really powerful stabilizing muscles that we've looked at already. Remember, we're starting with the layers that are a little less familiar to you, and we'll add on some of the more familiar layers at the end of this. Now we're going to move to the core. We already looked at the spine muscles. Really, in particular, we had two, the ropey pillars along each side of the spine, which we called the erector spinae muscles, and then the lateral stabilizers, which we called the quadratus lumborum. So those were the primary muscles we looked at. We saw that there were other muscles. Remember, we've looked at some of those already, like the rhomboids, and then we'll look at some others like the traps and the lats later on. But for our purposes, those are the main ones we're going to look at on the back. Now on the front, we're going to look at the core muscles, and I'm going to start by breaking them down each individually. But what's really helpful about understanding the core is noticing how they all work together. And remember, this really applies to the whole body, is that we're really trying to separate all of these different pieces when in reality they work together. That symphony effect that we talked about before. So let's hop into the core, and we'll start with the most familiar one to most of us, the rectus abdominis. I like to call the rectus abdominis the pretty abs. These are the six-pack abs. These are the ones that we like to think about when we think about core muscles, that we tend to envision when we think about having a strong core. But as you'll see, it's only one small part of the picture. So rectus abdominis is going to go from the lower ribs here down to the pubic bone. And if you read this in anatomy text, you'll see a long description of the origin and insertion. But as teachers, one of the most important things to remember is kind of this picture that we're drawing of where the muscles begin and end. So if you want to think about the costal cartilage and the xiphoid process here, you can think about those very specific terms that are written in your manual. Otherwise, it's simpler, I think, just to remember that this lower part of the ribs and the pubic bone are going to be the 2 points that the muscle is running from. So if you think about this muscle running more vertically here from the rib cage to the pubic bone, and you think about these 2 points drawing toward each other. Again, Fred doesn't move a lot because he's got a rod in his spine. But if you could imagine drawing these 2 points toward each other, you can really clearly see that the rectus abdominis is going to be our primary flexor of the spine. So when we look at rectus abdominis, we already know one really primary antagonist to this muscle. Right? We've got rectus abdominis as our spinal flexor, and maybe you remember the one we looked at on the back as our spinal extensor. Remember, the erector spinae muscles are going to be that primary antagonist as extending the spine, the one that held us upright. So the rectus abdominis is going to be this primary flexor, but what's really important about it is that it works with the erectors to hold us upright. So we talked about the erectors as really holding us up in relationship to gravity, but these two work together to position us in space to some extent. Now think about this though, what we already know about gravity and the bony structure of the skeleton, of the spine especially, is that our tendency is to round forward. Right? We don't end up getting tired and going like this. That could be an interesting scenario, but that we tend to do this. Part of it is also the eyes. Everything's in front of us, so we kind of tend to orient forward in addition to the structure of the spine and the pressure of gravity pressing down on us as well. So if we think about rectus abdominis, and we think about its full capacity in its movement scenario, in this kind of flexion scenario of the spine, its helpfulness to us is also going to be fairly limited because we know that our tendency is already going to be to go here. So though we really love to kind of put the six-pack abs up on a platform and really praise them for being really helpful core muscles, these muscles are actually pretty limited in their ability to create more functional movement, which we'll look at when we kind of put them all together. But for now, just remember lower ribs to pubic bone. Primary function is spinal flexion. And again, working in conjunction with the erectors here. So when we look at this, one of the really helpful things that can be really important for the rectus abdominis is to think about this case where we have hyperlordosis. So remember the muscle that we talked about that gets tight, that creates hyperlordosis, the one that pulls on the front of the spine here, the psoas muscle? Well, the rectus abdominis is going to be one of the abdominals here that helps to neutralize that. So if you imagine laying in your lower back here, the abdominals are going to help to neutralize that and prevent that. So clearly I could really engage that and flex my spine, but in a smaller capacity, its stabilizing function is more to help neutralize the effects of the psoas. So the psoas, remember, though it's pulling from the front of the spine, is also a lumbar extensor, or creating that lordosis. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky to picture in your mind, because we think about the back muscles extending the spine and the front muscles flexing, but the psoas in specific is going to be pulling on the front of the lumbar spine and taking us into extension. So the erectors and the psoas are going to be antagonists to the rectus abdominis. Rectus abdominis pulls us forward, psoas and erectors pull us more into extension. Remember, the psoas will only act on the lumbar spine, whereas the erectors will extend the entire spine. So they become this kind of balancing act of being able to have this balanced tone in both of them, balanced both flexibility and tone, to create this upright support, to create this nice posture. And remember, we talked about the lumbar spine as, again, being this kind of free-floating part of the spine, really needing a little bit more support than something like the thoracic spine, which is really well encased with the ribs and the rib cage itself. One other thing that's really helpful to consider before we talk about poses is the rectus abdominis. We've talked about really just this vigorous activation. So when we really exaggerate it, we're going to flex the spine here. So we might think about things like crow pose or things where we're really exaggerating that. But when we look at the subtlety of it, we see some other helpful tools in a yoga practice. So we talked about it neutralizing that hyperlordosis. So when we look at this in a yoga scenario, when I come into something like crescent lunge and I tend to lay into that lordosis, this is the muscle, the very top of this muscle is going to be what helps to knit the front ribs back, helps to draw the front ribs back to neutralize that tendency here to lay in the spine. So you can see a little better here. Right, if I come into crescent lunge, there's this tendency to lay in my low back. And just thinking about knitting the front ribs back is a common cue in a yoga class, right, to knit the front ribs back. And that's primarily cueing our upper rectus abdominis. So we've got the front ribs knitting back to help neutralize that hyperlordosis. So that's one side of it. We've got, remember, rectus abdominis going all the way down. So we've got the upper part of rectus abdominis helping to knit the front ribs back. Now, the very lower part of rectus abdominis is also really helpful for this positioning of the pelvis. So think about this. I exaggerate it and flex the spine. Notice what else is happening to my pelvis. There's this posterior tilting we talked about at the beginning. Remember, anterior is spilling the contents of the bowl, whatever it's holding, the contents of it out, versus the posterior tilt containing or holding onto the contents of the pelvic bowl. So in this flexion, as I come into this flexion with rectus abdominis here, I'm also engaging and posteriorly tilting the pelvis. So I can make that more subtle. Again, use it more of as a stability muscle. And think about this. A lot of times in yoga, we might say, tuck the tailbone, I like the cue lengthen the tailbone, reach down to the tailbone, however you want to cue that. There's many different ways you could cue that. But this posterior tilting of the pelvis, this little subtle action of the pelvis is going to be primarily controlled by the lower rectus abdominis. Now, clearly, we could also use our glutes to create that, right? And we talked about this really briefly with gluteus maximus being a posterior tilter of the pelvis as well. But when we make that more subtle, when I'm able to soften and unclench the glutes, we talked about trying not to clench the glutes, a lot of that refinement is coming from the lower part of rectus abdominis. In fact, you might even just stand up wherever you are. If you're sitting at your computer, it's always nice to take a little moment to stand up and just feel right above your pubic bone as you do just these little tiny movements and trying to make that movement as small as possible so that I'm not vigorously contracting to posteriorly tilt, but I'm really just trying to refine and make a tiny little movement just of my pelvis. And you'll feel that fine-tuned kind of awareness of the musculature really refined in that very lowest part of rectus abdominis. And this part usually tends to be a little less connected for most of us. It's pretty easy to tune into this upper part of rectus abdominis. We know that from the crunches and the core work that we love, that burn we love to hate in our crunches and our core work. We know that and we're really familiar with that, but this lower portion is usually a little less familiar. So feeling that can be a really helpful way just to connect to that refinement. And in your yoga classes, having your students connect to that awareness in very simple ways can be helpful as well. So rectus abdominis, we've got our six-pack abs. Primary function is flexion, but really the important function, the subtleties are knitting the front ribs back, that little movement, articulation of the pelvis into a posterior tilt, and to help to neutralize that hyperlordosis. So let's talk about this in a yoga sense, and really with that in mind, we could think of a lot of different poses. Really any pose where you tend to lay in your lower back, that might be helpful, and really it's going to be more dependent on the cues that you use. But we can think of some to exaggerate this one a little bit more. Crow was the one we mentioned already, that pushing and rounding and flexing of the spine to help lift the spine and the hips up into that pose would be really a big part of that, or part of that would be rectus abdominis. Cat pose here, again, rectus abdominis working to flex the spine here. Even something like lolasana as we lift up here or here, either variation you like. That flexion of the spine, that lifting up to draw you through is coming from that shortening or that flexing of the spine here. And then really, in my perspective, when we look at the abdominals, the big thing is that the abdominals really are not meant to be prime movers as much as prime stabilizers. Their prime function is to stabilize. Now, when we look at this biomechanically, if I move from the center of my body here, if I activate the core first, everything else will be more efficient. If I try and just use my arms to take me through my practice, you can imagine that my movement will be much less efficient if I'm working all in my arms, even something like going from plank to down dog or from down dog to plank. I want to be able to initiate these transitions and movements from the center of my body, which doesn't mean that it has to be like this really big core function turning on, but that there is a little bit of support and awareness so that the rest of my body moves more efficiently. And so, you know, anytime from my side on sports medicine, when we look at biomechanics, the first thing we do a lot of times is look at the core, because if the core is not functioning properly, everything else has to work harder. We see that even a little bit in the shoulders and the hips. If this stabilizing function of the shoulder, the core of the shoulder isn't doing its job, everything else has to work harder, the wrists and the elbows. So if I keep going upstream to the joint, the main joint at the top, or all the way back to the core, I'm going to hopefully make everything else more efficient. So this part here, our core, though it has this function of being able to flex the spine, especially rectus abdominis, its prime function is to be a stabilizer. not a mover. And this is important because when we come into core work, and I see this all the time with my patients and my students, they come in, they've got back pain, and they've been told they need to do core work, so they're doing crunches. But crunches are actually using it in a movement capacity, which is fine, right? It's one way to turn on the abdominals here. But if you think about a crunch, right, if I'm coming into my traditional abdominal work, right, nothing wrong with it. It's not a bad or a good thing. But what I'm doing here now is using my abdominals to move me, to create the movement, right? Versus whatever kind of crunch that might be for you. Clearly there's many variations on that. Whereas when I tap into my core to stabilize and I use it as I'm moving through my practice, I'm using it as a stabilizing function, but the rest of my body is really making a lot of the movement that I see. So my hips are supporting a lot of this, my legs are supporting this, and then of course my arms are making movements too. But this central part of my body is simply stabilizing so that the rest of my body can move more efficiently. And it's a helpful thing to understand because there's a lot of muscles that are really meant to be prime movers. Our glute maximus, we talked about pushing us forward in the gait cycle. Our quadriceps are clearly muscles that are built to move us and make really strong supported movements there. But the core muscles are really meant to support us and stabilize us from the center of the body to make the rest of the body more efficient in how it moves. So with that in mind, doing these postures in a yoga scenario where we're really shortening the muscle and doing crunches can be helpful to build a relationship with it. Maybe especially if it's a less familiar muscle to us, to build a little bit more tone, to exaggerate it. However, unless I start to work this muscle in its stabilizing function, it's not guaranteed that it's going to perform that stabilizing function. Which means that I really need to teach the muscle how to turn on as I'm moving through my practice. And in a yoga scenario, that's very simple, right? We do this a lot, actually. Knit the front ribs back, lengthen through the tailbone, trying to keep our students connected, moving them slow enough that they can stay connected to it so that it's not one rigid engagement here that they lose when they're transitioning, but it's this subtle support that they're able to connect to as they move and transition just as they would in their life. So, really important concept to understand. Abdominals really, and I'm talking about them as a whole to some extent here, that the core muscles here are really their prime function is to be stabilizers and not to be movers. So that the subtleties of what we do are really potentially more helpful for training these muscles. So when we look at the rectus abdominis, we can find that activation in many different ways. It could be dependent on the pose, looking at that flexion in the spine, or it could be more dependent on some of the subtle cues, knitting the ribs, lengthening through the tailbone or the sacrum, tucking the tailbone, the positioning of the pelvis. But that both of those will target either very subtly or more vigorously the muscle fibers of the rectus abdominis. Now, in order to lengthen the rectus abdominis, we see a whole group of postures that can do this. Again, you can imagine if this muscle is going from the rib cage to the pubic bone, all I have to do is the opposite movement here, extending the spine to re-lengthen the abdominals. And that one's pretty familiar to us. Up dog, cobra, back bends, really of any sort will create that re-lengthening for the rectus abdominis. So you could think of any of your favorite back bends. Really anytime you feel, especially I like to think of this as stretching the skin of the abdomen because the rectus abdominis is really going to be that first layer we meet down the center of the body right underneath the skin with the connective tissue and the fascia, of course, encapsulating it. So we can think about this kind of layer right underneath the skin. Now, one of the important things as we kind of tie all this up together with rectus abdominis before we move on is just to consider that the effects of this muscle are going to be limited because we spend our lives somewhat in flexion. So when we think about our core support muscles, we really want to be able to use them together as a community, not just continue to work a lot of this rectus abdominis, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's a great way to build familiarity and awareness with the core muscles. But I have to be able to use it with the other abdominals because my tendency is already to do this. So if I want the support of the abdominals, of the lumbar spine and the lower back, We'll move on to the others to look at how that shapes up as a team in the core. So next, let's shift gears and look at the obliques. So we've got the internal and the external obliques. Now, if you look in an anatomy book or you look in some sources online for the origin and insertion for the obliques, you'll see it's pretty wordy. And what I want you to think about as a yoga teacher, instead of memorizing all of those words, is to think about this, right? We've got the rectus abdominis going from here to here, shortening to flex the spine. Now, this next layer we're going to have is going to be the obliques. And I want you to think of them like an X shape. The external obliques are going to come up a little bit higher here, more from the sides, and go in this orientation. The internal obliques are going to start a little bit lower here and come up. Now, it doesn't create exactly an X shape, but it is somewhat of an X shape as you put those muscle fibers together, so that you can imagine the external obliques on one side in a similar orientation as the internal on the opposite side. And again, this side external obliques up here in a similar orientation with the internal obliques on the opposite side. So then I create this X shape, which allows for the primary function of the obliques being that of rotation and lateral flexion. So they allow us to do all sorts of rotational movements here, twisting movements as they work together. So with the obliques, we also see the capacity as we fire both sides together to flex the spine. But primarily what we're looking at is this ability now to rotate so that I'm using opposite sides. So if my right side external obliques and my right side external and my left side internal contract, they pull my rib cage and my opposite hip toward each other. And at the same time, the opposite side external and internal will be lengthening. So as I look at this kind of rotational capacity of the obliques, I've got one side shortening, again, drawing this end and this end toward each other as the opposite side of the X lengthens. So in a rotational scenario, we see opposite sides working together, and we get this nice antagonistic effect with the opposite side. So the antagonist to the right side external, the left side external and the right side internal would be the opposite side, the left side external, the right side external, and the left side internal. Don't let all of the words confuse you here. It's easier just to visualize this X shape. As one side shortens here, the other side gets longer. And as one side shortens here, again, the other side gets longer. So you can see how they work together. Now, for side bending, it's going to be the opposite. In order to laterally flex, it's going to be both the external and internal on one side contracting to draw me into this lateral flexion. And the synergist to that was a muscle we looked at on the back side of the body earlier. Remember the quadratus lumborum. So the obliques, two on the same side, will work together to create lateral flexion, and on the opposite side will create rotation. Now, if I fire all of them together, they'll create spinal flexion like rectus abdominis. Now, if you put all that together, that means the obliques can do all sorts of different rotational and side bending movements, which is why the classic exercise for this one is that bicycle move. Right, side to side, our very traditional core, not so much a yoga pose, but this traditional rotational component. As I rotate to my left here, again, I've got right side external, left side internal shortening, and then this opposite side lengthening. Same thing on the other side, left side shortening, left side external shortening, right side internal shortening, and then the opposite lengthening. So the same is true when we look at this in other rotated postures. So when we look at it in something like revolved crescent, right, I'll be using that same rotational movement in the obliques to contract. So now my left side external and my right side internal will be contracting to rotate me over to the side. Now, as a yoga teacher, you don't need to overthink this or overanalyze this, but just understanding that the obliques here are working together rotationally. So every time I do both sides, I'm going to be stretching and strengthening both sides of the obliques here. So twists are very balanced poses because as I move from one side to the other, one side's always lengthening as the other side is shortening. And that's actually true of a lot of the musculature around the spine as well. So we can see this really clearly working in twists. Now, the other interesting scenario we get into rotationally is coming into something like extended side angle. The obliques are also rotating and positioning the rib cage. So even though it's not a twisted posture, as I come into something like extended side angle here, I'm trying not to do this. So the obliques are part of what's helping me twist and rotate the rib cage toward the ceiling here to create that positioning of the rib cage. So it's not just the twisted or revolved postures, but also these open postures. Think about this in triangle too. This is one of the most common tendencies we see in triangle. Part of that is the obliques. And again, clearly the body is working together. It's not just one muscle. But the obliques are going to be helping to position the rib cage and rotate it in this open scenario as well. Now, the other side is the lateral flexion component. And we see this really in half moon really easily. When we look back to half moon, let's do a little recap first. Remember the bottom leg externally rotating to turn the knee and the foot forward, just like we have in our side-facing poses, using the external rotators, piriformis and the go-go cues. Then the lifted leg is going to be somewhat internally rotating to keep the foot parallel to the ground. So really we're using the abductors to lift this top leg up, this back leg up. So gluteus, medius, and minimus primarily. Then we talked about already one in the side waist here, helping to hold the torso up. You remember the quadratus lumborum. Now on top of that, superficial to that, we're also going to feel the obliques. So if you come into half moon there, you can feel really quickly with the top hand, this is more the oblique superficial to the QL, which is, remember, going to be very deep right next to the erectors here. So both of those will be working together. And if you stay in this higher version of half moon, you really feel those obliques and the QL muscle a lot quicker, remember, than putting the hand on the floor. So again, part of it depends on the modifications, the cues, the focal point, my awareness, the mindfulness of the practice, and even somewhat the style and the practice that you're doing that day of what you're focusing on. But the obliques, when I'm coming into this lateral flexion, will be the same side, so external and internal on that left side here, versus in rotational capacities, opposite sides firing to rotate, or all of them firing together to pull me into that same movement we looked at with the rectus abdominis. So a really helpful group of muscles, the obliques here, for helping to position the rib cage, for helping to articulate the rib cage side to side and rotationally. And to notice, if you look in your manual here, we're showing mostly the front of it, but if you look in other pictures of the obliques, you'll see that they do come onto the back side of the body here. So they create this kind of support all the way around the sides, which is a lot of what you feel when you're coming into half moon. You feel that oblique coming all the way around to the back side of the body there. So let's talk about poses, which we've already done a little bit already. Poses to strengthen it. Remember, we've got the twisting poses. The key to this one is that, remember, you've probably experienced this in your own practice, but it's really easy for me to come into twist and not use my abdominals at all, or even to really use my arms and my legs and use very little of my abdominals. We see this in the seated poses as well. I don't really have to use my abdominals here. But what I want to think about is either more of that active twisting where I'm using my arms less, or also this lengthening of the midline and just the subtle cues that we create to rotate the torso here without just pushing ourselves in as far as we can. I lose a lot of that oblique support as I start to flex the spine as well, instead of focusing on that lengthening and rotating that comes from the obliques here. So the position, Just the mindfulness, some of it's just paying attention to what you're using the core rather than just the arms to take you into it. And things like standing poses instead of laying on the arm, I really like to get people to lift the belly and the chest away from the leg, which will start to activate and turn on the abdominals as a whole, as a team. We talked about this in Half Moon, and really a lot of these similar poses that we looked at in QL. So as I get lighter on this arm and extended side angle, maybe even floating it up, I'm going to feel more in those obliques here. Same thing in reverse warrior. I'm eccentrically contracting or lengthening as I engage this side of the obliques in the QL. And that they work together to support me, kind of similar to what we looked at with the QL. So now when we talk about stretching or lengthening the obliques, all we have to think about is the opposite side. So if we're twisting, knowing this X-shape configuration, all I need to do is twist to the opposite side. If we're side bending, again, knowing this configuration, all I have to do is side bend to the opposite side, which is great because in yoga, we do things pretty symmetrically. We always do the second side. So when I do both sides, I have this nice synergistic or antagonistic both relationship within the obliques themselves.